Hi, everyone. Just had the pleasure of speaking with Rob Auten. Rob is a video game writer behind Gears of War Judgment Day, which he co-wrote with Tom Bissell. He also is the CEO of Hexagram, a game studio that focuses on kind of ARGs and immersive game experiences for all kinds of interesting partners. We talked about narratives, toys, playing video games, his path into them, how to get into the industry, narrative structure, comparative literature, game design, puzzle boxes, all kinds of topics that I think were very interesting. I thought it was a very refreshing and optimistic view on technology and the role of play in it. I hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you. Rob, I really appreciate your time. I know it's been you've been jet setting the world. Welcome back to your house, Dubai. You survived New York.
It's nice to be home. Yeah, no, great trip. Got to see Dennis, which was always a treat. Did a couple other things, saw some other friends, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful. And I hear you have relocated on a mostly permanent basis to Honolulu.
I have, yeah. My partner is Polynesian, and our child, we just think it's better for her to live here than at least California. We like it more. It's better
amazing.
for kids. Work is better here, and there's just more opportunities than. She's from French Polynesia, and Tahiti is wonderful. It is. It's just very tiny and small, and here we have kind of the benefits of international world, but still the benefits of Polynesia. So both are good.
And you're not too far. Totally. Look at you, the island girl. Well done.
Yeah. No, she's very beautiful and very lucky. And our daughter is, she's doing hula, and she's like really tapped into the Hawaiian Polynesian lifestyle now. So it's good. She has her Japanese class, and it's just very multicultural here, which we like, and safe and kid friendly. But
that's amazing.
Rob, why don't we get into the interview? I have so many questions. I read your essay.
Okay, great.
I started listening to one of your podcasts that you did about 10 years ago on some show called Rocket Jump.
Yes. Logan's thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I listened to a lot. I checked out your Twitter feed from like 10 years ago and looked at it all. Yes. I was looking at Hexagram.
Lots of cobwebs.
No, I think the cobwebs are interesting. I wanted to, the first question I had before one of the interviewers were asking you about your go-kart horse farm, and I was curious if you could tell us more about that and how, if anything, that's had an effect on your trajectory.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, so many years ago, I grew up on a dirt road in a town called Bedminster, New Jersey, and in the backyard, which was ample, it was probably had about 5 or 6 acres to ourselves. There was an old barn. There was the remnants of a silo. And my father who was not using the property as a horse farm, had decided to convert, with the tractor and I don't know, probably some digging, had decided to convert sort of what used to be, I think, the main sort of paddock area for the horses into a go-kart track. So there was probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 go-karts. And so I learned how to drive relatively young on dirt with go-karts. And so I think one of the other kids, or one of my parents' friends, had like a kid model. And so when they would come over, they would bring in a little trailer, like the kid model, and then he and I would take turns riding the go-karts. As to what effect it's had on my career, I can't really specify other than we just had a group retreat in upstate New York with the whole not the whole, but with a lot of the Hexagram team, and apparently my driving scares people. So that was I did learn that I guess I'm so accustomed to kind of windy, sort of hilly country, narrow roads that some of the other members of the team who are from places like the Midwest, where there aren't as many twisty, mountainy roads, were admitted to being a little more than a little uncomfortable with my somewhat cavalier attitude towards taking curves at speed. So I don't know. So it probably hasn't helped in the. I have to now make sure that I'm a little bit more gentle with my team when behind the wheel.
When you were driving the go-karts, did you and your friends engage in a world building, like imaginative play, or did you just stay in the
No, actually, I
physical
mean,
reality?
to be honest, the yeah, that's very physical reality. But I mean, so around this piece of property was a couple hundred acres of what are now or what is now Donald Trump's golf course, and the town of Bedminster, New Jersey, has become somewhat infamous as sort of the whatever the summer palace for Trump. And so those forests, which originally belonged to John DeLorean, best known for the car, were just kind of the playground. And there, I think that was much more the sort of like, let's go pretend or play whatever in the woods experience than the go-kart track was like you wanted to be as in the moment as possible.
And then what kind of play did you guys do? I mean, I'm curious because I think that might have influenced. I'm just curious where that influence in just game design and game writing originally first started. So you think it's in the
Yeah.
forest?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, friends would come over and we would, run around the woods, climb trees. And I do think, we would play, we would pretend that, one of us was a Jedi and one of us was, Darth Vader, or that, we were Robin Hood, kind of detective stuff was big. And that was the stuff that I was sort of reading and writing at the time, not writing in a serious way, but like writing like little stories, like, like kids do, was definitely around the kind of like, well, I would say the fantastical, though not necessarily the fantasy genre. Like, I think other than Lord of the Rings, I never had much of a fantasy inclination, but I loved sci-fi and I loved mysteries and it's from Sherlock Holmes to Encyclopedia Brown, all that kind of stuff. So I think those were the fields where we were playing the most fervently.
And then how old are you, Rob? You're like 40 or something. How old?
Yeah, I'm 45 now. No, 44.
Great. So you grew up in a pre-internet, real physical world. So I'm just
Yeah. No, I first used the internet in I think 1996 at the New York Public Library. Like we had to drive into, and so it's about a 45-minute drive from where I grew up into the city. And yeah, a friend of mine went into to research books about the United States presidency for a paper that we had to write.
And then before we go maybe into your high school experience, just did you go to, I think you on the podcast, you talked about going to Montessori. I'm curious if you did or not. Maybe I misrecall
No,
that.
I think I was kidding. I just went to the regular local public school. That was nothing, did nothing philosophical or attitudinal about it.
Okay, interesting. Because my daughter goes to a Waldorf school
Mm-hmm.
and they are very protective of the childhood state. And one of the things I was very curious about your essay you sent me, which I'll post as well, is that you had a lot about character design. And one of the most interesting things about Waldorf is that all the toys don't have faces
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
in the Waldorf world. And the reason obviously is that they want to allow for the child to have more imagination to have kind of a limitlessness over what the toy actually is. Because they think
I'm
that having the
surprised that this hasn't. Oh, God, I'm sorry.
No, I was curious what you think about that in terms of character design.
No, I was just curious. I was surprised that this hasn't been employed in some horror movie. I mean, it seems like it's really, really like something that, as an adult, would probably be pretty creepy. Faceless dolls. I don't know. I mean, you tell me. When you see them, do they
I
stir
think
like? Do you
it's
see an opportunity space, or do you see something vaguely unsettling?
I think it depends on the lens you're looking at it. Maybe because you went to public school and that's kind of a more institutional experience. I would imagine it more to be a horror. But in the Waldorf world, they're so already kind of in a fantasy cult land already. So
Sure.
And then it's interesting because my sister goes to a Montessori. She owns a Montessori school. She's a teacher and an administrator and whatnot. And in Montessori, they consider everything called work. So I thought it'd be interesting to discuss just the different educational models and how they kind of encourage play. And I was curious what you think about there's a lot of talk now in terms of play in school, and you're
Sure.
like a professional play designer. So I'm curious what you think about play just as a general sense for kids, adults,
Yeah.
or
So the thing that I've learned The thing that I've learned is with kids. I mean, I don't have a kid or any kids, and so what I've learned from watching friends go through that experience is that as designers, it's incredibly difficult to anticipate what's going to pull any particular child, and that and even things like even though we play test and even though we test or focus groups or whatever it is, the sort of rubric around like by putting kids into that sort of that moment where you're in this empty room with a big mirror and we want you to play with this toy, that the way that kids will perform in that kind of environment, they know essentially that they're theater, and that they're play acting a scenario for the benefit of the grown-ups around them. And so I don't really you'd have to really talk to an educator. I think your sister would be a far better person to answer that question than I, just because I don't have a lot of experience with the way that particularly young kids truly play, other than some memory of having done so myself, which was very much inspired by a lot of it. I mean, was indoors too. I mean, a lot of it was being outside and running around, and mom would tell us to go run around the house when we were acting up, and that was that was sort of play as punishment, I guess. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not really something that I don't. With kids, I don't think I can speak to with any real authority.
In your essay, you had this great line saying that Wolverine does not attend many tea parties. And yes. I think that just says exactly what you were just talking about, how kids, you have no idea what they're going to do with the toy, right? So you design this Wolverine character and then suddenly, my daughter will use it in a who knows how. So I think that's an interesting thing. And
oh, yeah. I know all the time that's spent into making the claws extend and having a cool sound come out of it, but none of that will be as important as the fact that Wolverine is filling an empty seat in somebody's hypothetical tea party, for sure.
So I think going back to the Waldorf thing, I think they're very interested in keeping kind of established narrative out of the child's mind to allow the child to really have its own fluidity and creative story making and literacy and child play. They think that the narratives outside, in the real world, affect and fix the child's creative play. So I'm curious if you think, I'm curious where you think play as an adult. I have a friend who says every year of school, they chip away your personality and kind of form you into a block, right? You start as this beautiful diamond, and each year they just layer away your creative ability. So I'm curious how you think your concept
sounds like your friend is a frustrated creative person.
Yeah, so I'm curious, how do you maintain your play? I mean, I know you personally, you seem very happy and go lucky. So I'm just, what happens to some people that they lose that ability to play or just enjoy life, I guess?
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a choice, really. I mean, well, that's not necessarily fair, actually. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why. First of all, I think that deep down, most people somewhere in them want to have a good time, right? They don't want to, sit silently in, retrenching past failures. They don't want to just stare at the ceiling and, wish for the whole world to go away. I mean, that's not what people want to do. And there's a lot of reasons why a person could end up in a situation where they feel like they have lost the capability to play. And most of those reasons are, typically very sad, or what, from an external perspective, we might think of as being, something happened to this person, and they've lost their ability to feel joy, or that ability has been dulled. And, I mean, again, it's all perspective, and maybe they're super happy, just plotting revenge night after night in their minds. But for most people, it's, that's not the inclination. That's not the way that our minds fortunately seem to naturally drift. So I think it's somewhat fair to say that within, in sort of like the brain, in our lizard brain or whatever it is, we have both the capability, and we have the capability for a wide range of emotions. Within them is a sensation, that's called fun, and we have associations with that that feeling, like time compression, as they say, and physical reactions like laughter, and so I think it's that's all for the most part inherent. And so I don't personally feel that that like the sort of another brick in the wall sort of scenario that you were describing from your friend is true, because I've never personally felt that way. I mean, and some of that maybe because I was really lucky, and I went to a nice little public school with good teachers, and a great, like, my friends in my class were funny and smart and wanted to do cool things, and so I had a fairly fortunate, I think, scenario, just that's all just a bunch of invisible die being rolled somewhere, that put I just got lucky, I think. And so to me, I never felt like sort of the massive weight of societal oppression on my shoulders telling me that I had to take a middle management job, and I don't know what, in Lord knows what. So yeah, I think that for those who have had to make those decisions, even then, I don't think that it dulls the capability for self-expression, for participating in kind of game-like behaviors. I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to play video games per se. It doesn't mean you have to play Parcheesi. It just could be, singing along at a concert. I mean, or even just doing stuff by yourself. I mean, like, driving a little too fast over curvy roads. That was certainly a lot of fun when we were in high school. And looking back, it was a terrible idea. But I mean, that was play, and it was sort of, it was testing yourself as opposed to kind of, it was antisocial behavior, really. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that the capability is inherent. I think that it's fortunately there for most people. I think it is, as a default, I think we are much better off as a society that our brains are wired to allow us to have fun and allow us, to, like, we get chemical and all kinds of other stimulus from joyful behaviors. And so, to your friend, all I can say is, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way, man. But I bet your friend, especially given I know, like you have a tendency to surround yourself with really ebullient people and ebullient people. So I know you're probably deep down your friend is not as much of a curmudgeon as that one quote may make him sound.
No, I think he's trying to battle all the curmudgeon effects that he had in school, and then he kind of goes the opposite route, trying to have all kinds of extreme sports and going to that. So he's definitely channeled it. It's just interesting when you have kids to really see how they naturally have this incredible imaginative power, and it seems like kids lose it as they get older, at least the exterior presentation of that. So
yeah, well, it may be that we switch from kind of more of a, especially if you're doing some of the sort of more right brain favoring elementary school programs. I mean, it is probably true that like the reading, writing, arithmetic world, there isn't a place there traditionally for. I mean, I guess there's art, but I mean, even that's so sort of standardized. I mean, it's sort of like, okay, today we're going to do X. It's never. I mean, rarely, I think, in a sort of a government, related school, is it sort of like, cool, today we're going to do whatever you want. So, I mean, it is possible. I mean, it is fair to say, I think, but I think also, I mean, within each of those disciplines, for those who care to look for it, I think there is space for self-expression. I mean, certainly, like, I played a lot of music, when I through high school and even into college a bit. That was fun. And, and that set me on a journey of, like, opened up my ears, so to speak, to listening to a lot of different kinds of music that, that probably I wouldn't have discovered had I not played music and sort of actually been interested in, the outer limits of the music that I was playing, and for things like jazz and stuff like that.
Rob, where did you go to college? Or what did you study?
I studied English, and then I had a minor in neuroscience.
Nice. And how did you channel that into a career in, I guess, game design or game writing and kind of world building?
Well, that story is a little bit more of a series of fortunate events, I guess you could say.
One more call.
Than an intention.
question about
Yeah,
your
go ahead.
college. Was it more focused on creative writing or more on literature and analysis? Or I'm curious.
I wrote a thesis. At the end of it all, I wrote a thesis on that was almost more of a comparative literature thesis, I guess, but it was looking at the trope of the Tower of Babel and the ways in which it serves as a symbol for this kind of idea of a quest for a perfect language, and the notion that there was a perfect language that has been lost. And then through the ensuing centuries, there have been many, often well-intentioned but occasionally comic attempts to rekindle that experience of all language being one, or sort of that removing that gap between sort of the word and the thing that it represents. And I just thought it was a really fun topic. I mean, and just an interesting kind of lens through which to look through the history of language. But yeah, I mean, so it ended up. I mean, certainly I used literature references, and tropes from literature in the thesis, but I also worked in a lot of philosophy and kind of the comp lit sort of crowd.
So Rob,
to really get.
How did you translate that into then? I'm curious how that then jumped into kind of a more creative writing experience.
Yeah, I mean, I took a creative writing class, but I also, it was one of those things that, in my own mind, it was like, if I want to do that, I'm going to just. I mean, I had a wonderful teacher in the creative writing class, but like it just didn't seem to me. I didn't see it as an undergraduate. It didn't seem like the place to explore. College in general just didn't seem like the place to explore, like sort of like, was I going to write a novel as a 20-year-old? Probably not, because it would, doing so would be at the expense of everything else that I was going to do. And if I had wanted to write a novel or something like that, I probably would have, gone for an MFA somewhere, and had that been the sole focus. But I didn't do that, so I wasn't terribly pulled in that direction.
So then how did, I'm curious, tell me more about this random journey into, I guess, game design, video games and toys and all that.
Yeah, what happened with me? So I ended up getting, through a friend in college, sort of I don't know, like a internship is a strong word. But I mean, I was basically assisting this guy named Mark Webb, who's a film director in LA, who had been in directing a bit, had started as an editor, had been cutting his own stuff, and he got so busy and he just needed help doing some of the bare bones elements of music video editing, which is things like just basically watching the 4 hours of, or just sort of or sitting there as the 4 hours of tape goes into a hard drive that then you can use on. This was an Avid at the time, so you have the tape just sort of gets played, and watching and make sure that process goes okay. Watching the footage to see where there are some cool moments, maybe doing a little bit of highlighting, putting markers down on some of those moments so somebody else would be able to come by and look at them later. And yeah, and and then sort of like making sure that at the end we got like the when you hit play that there were no missing frames or beeping noises or whatever else. And so I kind of, yeah. So I mean, so I was, and then eventually I worked with a bunch of other people, just where I just kind of learned enough to where I was able to start editing myself, and did that for a while. And that to me, especially at the time, it was sort of the end of the era of like when I started working in music videos, the budgets were like $500,000 or more, for big ones. By the time I finished working in music videos, the budgets were like $50,000 or less for most of them. So it was interesting to watch sort of the way that the technology, like think tools like Final Cut, just the prevalence of DV, the way that all that stuff came together and began this sort of race to the bottom, where you would have a couple people in a garage for 4 weeks churn out a really beautiful animated video that looked like it cost $250,000, but actually cost $25,000. And then the record companies would come back and be like, "Cool, what can we get for 15?" You know what I mean? Like, and that was still plenty of money for two people or whatever, more or less. And so they would take it because it was all, the idea was, it was sort of you got more clout, you got signed by a production company, you got bigger budgets, and it just didn't really work out that way, because I mean the tech was making these tools so much more accessible to people. Things mean, YouTube was still a couple of years out. This is probably around like 2003 to, 6. And, or no, actually 2001 to 6. Yeah, so the tools, but it was becoming easier to create and distribute video on through digital platforms. And there are some of these people made it, and either started businesses or became directors and make cool stuff. Mark, for example, has made a whole bunch of movies and TV shows, and has done really well. But a lot of the people who were in or around the same stuff that I was doing, are still working as designers, still working as still working in this world, but didn't. Not everybody kind of got to be the next, whoever, big director X, the next David Fincher. I guess I think that's probably around that time. David Fincher, directed Madonna videos, and then he directed Aliens and Seven, and was like, bam, I think that was what everybody was like, cool. If you put your nose to the grindstone long enough, that you can be David Fincher. That would definitely be the ring that everybody was reaching for. So anyway, and then I got involved just totally randomly through that world, through a director that I had worked with. Pulled me, this guy named Marco Brambilla, pulled me into a meeting with a small French video game company that I had never heard of, called Ubisoft. And I hadn't played games for a while. I had played games growing up, but I hadn't played games for a while since, like probably around mid high school. I slowed down on playing games, and hadn't really played in college. And so invited me to this meeting, and we ended up getting a contract to do cinematics for an upcoming Tom Clancy shooter called Rainbow Six. And so that was, and 3 days later, I was on a plane to New York. We did all the animation with a company called PsyOp, who at the time had just moved into a pretty big office in the Lower East Side. They were doing well, and so I sort of learned about games by working on the parts of the game that you don't play, and then in the meantime, kind of picking back up. Like I bought an Xbox, I bought a PS2, I think at the time, yeah, and was just playing everything I could get my hands on, especially some of the kind of weirder stuff. I mean, once you've played one first-person shooter, well, you haven't played them all, but there was a lot of other things that were going on at the time, like games like Rez, that just were kind of coming out of nowhere, seeming like from they had no real clear antecedent. Well, sure, there's probably something, but things that just seemed, especially you've been out of playing games for 6 or so years. Some of that stuff was just like, or even rhythm games, like there was a bongo game, even Guitar Hero, the first Guitar Hero. I was working at Take-Two at the time, and I think it was the day that it came out, and somebody had pre-ordered it, and it was published by this pretty like random. It wasn't even really like a video game publisher. It was sort of like a mail order service that sort of akin to Netflix for games, I think, if I remember correctly, that published Guitar Hero. And we were just fascinated by the idea of like using this crazy controller to play a game. And then suddenly it was this massive hit that nobody expected. I mean, that's why they, to the point where these guys, Harmonix, had to publish it with this, non-traditional publishing partner, because everybody said no to them because nobody thought it would ever take off. And then boom, there it was. Anyway, so I started working on the non-playable parts of the games, and then eventually made my way into to working on working with narrative designers and working on the narratives for other games. And that's when I learned a lot, or started kind of really paying attention to the design documents and how people were structuring things and how people were thinking about things in this kind of AAA big $70 $60 game world.
And is that when you started getting into the Gears of War series, or was that earlier than that? I guess that.
Well, yeah. So basically, I had met a fellow named Tom Bissell at GDC when I forget, gosh, I don't whatever year it was, and he had just finished was finishing a draft of a book called Extra Lives that he wrote about his relationship to games, and some featuring some game creators, and a series of essays about games. And at the time, I knew a little bit about how games were made. Tom knew, probably he would say, next to nothing about how games were made, but we both were playing a lot. And I think in part because I had like, Tom has a very like he had a very established literary background. Like he worked at a publisher. He wrote articles. I mean, he did the things that you do to become a writer. And I had done this kind of topsy-turvy path of having had all these kind of, I was a music video editor, but we shared a lot of taste in we shared a lot in games, we shared a lot in fiction, we shared a lot in journalism. And he'd recommend me great stuff. And I mean, we became pretty good friends pretty quickly. And so he had finished this book, and he had made all these contacts in the industry in the process of writing this book. And we kind of, we made friends, and we kind of came up with this sort of kooky idea that we would just use my, credit or two and Tom's, ins or, access to some of these people to see if we could maybe get a gig working on a game. And so Tom had written a pretty lengthy article in the New Yorker about Epic Games and had great contacts there. And so we sent an email over, and I think the reply was sort of like, really? Like, are you kidding? Like, this isn't what you do. And I think they thought it was, like, the dude who wrote the article for the New Yorker wants to write one of our games. Like, isn't that beneath them? And so they said, cool, okay, well, as it happens, we're sending like a brief out to some people to potentially, it's sort of a writing test to sort of work on our next title. And, so they gave us a little scenario, and we sat down, we wrote some scenes, and we won the writing test. And so they said, okay, like, if you're sure you want to do this, you and your buddy, me, can write, what became Gears of War Judgment. Yeah. And so we flew out to Cary and met everybody, and basically spent, oh gosh, I don't know, 2+ years, give or take, where, we were, well, at least one of us was there almost always a week a month. And got to know a lot of really great people there, and got to kind of see the beginnings of what is now Fortnite. And it was a really interesting time. And that company's obviously had quite a decade, and we were kind of there at the beginning of that change.
Rob, as the writers, what was the relationship with the creative directors or the art directors? Was that kind of symbiotic, or I'm just curious how that?
Totally. So we worked with a couple different creative leads there. I mean, all of whom I think we had pretty much great times working with, great relationships with. And I mean, essentially, the relationship was pretty simple, because it would be both gears that I worked on, we pretty much started we started with nothing. And so we spent a lot of time just in meetings, talking about like what the game could be. And so there was a version of Judgment that was actually going to be a series of sort of short stories that would be told around a campfire. And it would just sort of be like, 4 levels or whatever, probably more, but some number of hours of gameplay but then it would come back, and that little tale would end, and you'd go to the next person, and they would say, oh yeah, you think that was crazy? Well, let me tell you what happened to me on Emergence Day. And then boom, you go into that story. We ended up doing something that was a little bit like that, but not exactly. I mean, it was through this whole process of kind of talking it out. And, everybody, like with games, there's a couple different, there's like what I want to play. There's this version in everybody's head of who the audience is. There's this sort of like, I don't know, there's just this blank slate, really. There's this thing with eyes and legs that represents the player. And there's also sort of things like what's right for the franchise, and there's things like strategically what makes sense. Doing something like if we had made Judgment a free-to-play shooter, that would have been super fashion forward at the time that we chose to do it, and of course we didn't. But I mean, that could have been an amazing business, from a business strategy perspective, that could have been an amazing decision. But we'll never know, because that's not the way that it went. So it's really just about like it's like being in a writer's room. I mean, when it's good, it's like being in a writer's room. When it's bad, somebody hands you like essentially an outline and says, please write compelling, heartfelt characters here. and then leaves the room and locks the door behind them until you've done your job. So it's but the Gears experience in particular was really great.
It's interesting because I always think the most famous characters I think of, the Nintendo or Metal Gear Solid, they have a very strong kind of director, writer, creative director. So I almost think they're like
Kojima,
yeah, they've become like the dictator of the world. And they I don't know if they have a writer's room. So it's interesting to see how collaborative your process was. So
I think I don't know what it's like to work for either Miyamoto or Kojima, but I suspect that Nintendo in particular, I suspect, though I do not know, is a far more collaborative place. I mean, and Kojima is the only person in pretty much the games industry who gets his name on the box, right? He's really gotten himself into a pretty impressive position. But most games are, by and large, certainly a collaborative medium, no question about that. More so even than like most film sets, because especially when you're doing like shorter stuff, like on a commercial or music video shoot, where I have more experience than sort of the marathon of feature filmmaking. The director is the guy or the girl or the person or whoever. The director is the boss, because you're only going to be here for 2 days and you need to get stuff done fast. And so that person is holding the wheel. That train is going down the track. And so games are, 2-3 years to make a game. Can be a team of, some stuff we've worked on, over 200 people, I think, have touched in various capabilities easily. So there's always somebody who's got that job of creative director, but really they're almost more like a basketball coach for a team of people that are all the, other disciplines, where they're just trying to, get them all to make sure that, that the ball goes in the hoop on the right side of the field. It is a little bit more like that kind of dynamic. Some people, obviously say, oh, the general, and I'm like, but it's not, there's no enemy. The enemy's ennui, the enemy's just sort of like morale. It's more about kind of, finding ways to let people see bright, shiny objects every, couple of weeks, so they know that they're on the road towards, making something that's hopefully people are going to want to play, or that's going to be, received as and seen as being worth the time that was put into it. I think that's the real, the real thing. There's a lot more games that just go away in the middle of production than there are films that, halfway through everybody goes like, you know what, maybe this wasn't such a great idea. Like that the games are, a very different medium in that way.
Rob, when you returned back to video games, when you first got the opportunity at, I think it was Take 5, you said, or the Rainbow Clancy, Tom Clancy game, what was your feeling? You were in this literature world that's kind of high art, and then you entered the video game, just maybe on a personal level. How did you feel about video games at that time? Were you kind of amazed?
I just saw. So in the time, like in the 6 years or so that I wasn't playing video games, and that's probably, let's say 1994 to 2000 or so, things like real-time physics got much more standardized. Real-time lighting became much more possible, or you see it more. Open world games, like, when I got back into video games, I'm pretty sure it was right around the time that Grand Theft Auto 3 came out, and it was like, whoa, this is different. This is news. So I kind of like Rip Van Winkle. I went to sleep in a world where the most complicated from a 3D perspective thing that I would maybe be playing would be something like a flight simulator, and then woke up in the world of GTA and Splinter Cell and and all of these, and Halo, which were just totally night and day compared to what I had imagined a video game was going to be, in the 6 or 7 years prior, when I just hadn't stopped playing as much. So I saw massive amounts of potential, both for the industry, for the creators. Just as somebody who's interested in, I don't know, toys, I guess. This, maybe that's inherent, but I was like, this really feels like the future. So it was fun because I had kind of like left the music video world working on kind of like the more technical side of it. Like I was doing a lot of stuff with green screen and animation and early CG or 3D CG, and not that early, but relatively early for at least on like a kind of consumer platform. Like you could buy a Mac and you could run Maya on it and put some Maya object into a video in After Effects, and suddenly you had like a 3D object and you're talking to your star, and that and you could just do that in your house. That was insane at the time. And so I kind of gravitated towards the more technical side of that world, and also to help me distinguish myself from the many other editors who were out there and entering the industry, with whom I was competing. And so then, with games, it just sort of seemed like, okay, cool, like let's try to learn this language and see what I can do, to find a little space.
The openness of the video game potential, does that challenge you or free you? I'm just curious, considering when you were doing the music videos or even traditional kind of movie stuff, it's a very linear narrative. So I'm curious how you compare that to just game design seems so much bigger. You have a whole world, everything from the character, or not. I'm curious what you think the differences are.
Yeah, I mean, so most AAA big budget video games, even now, are reducible to something that is essentially a very long screenplay, and then as an appendix to that screenplay, there are a series of moderately complicated Excel or spreadsheets, and so within that sort of screenplay format, sometimes you will find like little instructions, like if this thing happened before, then read line A instead of line B. But even now, I started playing God of War the last couple of days, which just came out, and so far first couple hours are awesome. But I mean, I haven't hit a point, and I'm 2 and change hours into the game. I know there is a part of the game coming where sort of the world will open up, and I'll have the ability to choose what section I might want to tackle first, or at some point, maybe even then, it'll probably be a few more hours at least before I hit that point where it's about what I want to do and not what I'm being essentially told to do, right? So in every point in the game so far, it's go find your kid, go battle, not to give anything away, Thor, fight the bear, do this, do that, and there's not really, other than kind of noodling around in the back looking for little hidden pick-me-up things, there's not really a lot of choice in there. And this is as big budgeted game as games get. On the other side, there is like GTA, but I think in GTA 4, towards the end, you had to choose essentially if you were going to save your girlfriend or your cousin or something like that. But that was the only explicit choice in the whole game. But one can argue that GTA, at more or less any point in time, assuming you're not on a mission, you can just kind of go noodle around and do whatever it is that you like. And so therefore you are kind of participating in a nonlinear experience, but the narrative of the game itself is still linear, right? So if you just go into a bank and start spraying bullets, that doesn't actually change your story. Your story is pretty much always going to be the same for everybody. And so that's still the paradigm. I mean, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Most of which is, the easiest one is economic, which is just to say, why make 3 versions of something if most of your audience is only going to see one of them, right? And then obviously there are some smaller titles that typically have a cheaper or lesser cost per minute in terms of asset quality, animation quality. There's just, it doesn't necessarily cost as much, or there just isn't as much of the game, so it isn't the 100-hour experience that some games are, or even the 40-hour experience that some games are. If you're making a shorter game, with relatively high production value, that's about choice and about narrative, then you are more inclined to do that because that's the whole point of the game, right? But it's largely there aren't a lot of situations that I can think of, and I'm sure someone will prove me wrong, where you have what people consider to be a big video game, like a Halo or something, where there's a significant amount of like other than I guess some role playing games, but there's a significant amount of like actual influence by the player into the narrative of the story. For the most part, the story is the story, and obviously there are exceptions to that rule.
In the essay you sent me, you referenced it as the guide rails. So the player is always on the guide rails. When you were in the writer's room, is that what you first established? You kind of do the narrative arc and then have the branches that kind of play off that arc, or how do you guys approach
Yeah,
that?
no, that's right. I mean, I think with Gears, I mean, the narrative arc was actually talking about the whole, well, after a certain point, it became a conversation about like, what are the next N number of games going to be, right? So there was this massive narrative arc. And then it was sort of like, okay, cool. If this big thing that's going to, take 9 games or whatever, is the story, then okay, then this is act 1, this is act 2, this is act 3 of that story. And then that means that the story of game number 1 pretty much has to be X. And obviously those arcs and those wheels within wheels changed over the course of production, and certainly that first story changes and did change over production. But that's kind of the way that they were thinking about it, which I really enjoyed. It was sort of like, okay, let's go super big, just so we don't end up in a situation where we're like, okay, why are we like, what? How do we get our heroes out of this predicament, right? So it's like, let's go super big, so we know what the goal is, and then zoom in to medium diopter and figure out the story for the one game, and then really get micro on the moments and the levels and the individual exchanges within those levels. And again, the output of that is pretty much a screenplay, and then with the tables in the back for things like all the possible things that a character can say in multiplayer when they pick up a health pack, and it's like, yeah, I love it, like and then there's like you have to write like 100 of those or more per character, and there are many dozens of characters and many long nights just sort of rambling away into a spreadsheet about things that you might say if you picked up. It's like a Family Feud kind of challenge.
I saw you had that one YouTube lecture, I think in Ukraine. You were at a video game, and you were talking about how you tried to create an if statement protocol for the players.
Yeah, that's fun.
And the engineers just were like, no. So I thought that was hilarious that the engineering department kind of vetoed your.
That got shut down really quick, and sort of amusingly, but. It was, that was, I mean, just to tell the story exactly. The idea was just if I need the health pack a lot, I should say something a little bit more exuberant than if I don't need the health pack so much. So if I'm at like 98% health and I pick up, the health pack, it should be like, oh, okay, I'll patch that up, like pretty cavalier about the whole thing. Whereas if I'm at 2% health and I pick up a health pack that restores me to full strength, I should be like, just absolutely overjoyed. I mean, and it gives my thinking was that it gives the actors a little something to do as well, because they're I mean, voice actors in the games industry they're all saints. I mean, they just come into these sessions and spend 4 hours often just destroying their vocal cords, screaming into the void, just the most random stuff. And
no context or anything.
Well, I mean, you picked up a health pack, 80 lines, like, like, great, nice one. Like, it's just like, and you have to do it loud because you have to, it has to like, and you're in battle and you picked up a health pack, and so anything you can do, I think, to just give a little bit more context, I think you're going to get better performances rather, for the players. I mean, like, I think the actors will have more to chew on. I think that the player, you're not going to advertise that you're doing this, but they will subtly make the connection between like their character is expressing, a higher level of joy and relief when they were almost dead, and that's kind of now you're sort of as the storyteller. It's like you're there with the player a little bit more, like you're watching their face as you tell the story, and you're getting little bits of. And it might change, like if you speed things up or slow things down or really hang on a detail. Like you can become a better storyteller if you and the player are kind of, holding each other's hand, and you're guiding them through this story rather than sort of just barking at them with, in a single cadence, which is, I think, starting to happen. Like, I think we're, I know there are other people who have given talks about sort of adaptability of narrative and yeah, I mean, there's some interesting work that's being done. There's a guy at Insomniac who's spoken about it a lot. I mean, so it's not like this is a lost cause. It's just it's also a massive amount of work to be done on a game, and for the writer to kind of stick his head into the engineering room or bug the producer and sort of say like, oh, I got this great idea. I mean, it was fairly naive of me to expect that they'd be like, oh, well, perfect. What we'll do is we'll stop working on the renderer that allows the game to play at 60 frames a second, and put a guy on your kind of like very, very subtle request. So I'm not too grumpy about that.
Is that why you and Tom wrote the companion book, the Krug Companion, I think it's called? Was that a business decision or kind of a creative one to allow for people to get deeper into the world?
Oh, well, no, actually, that was so I wrote that book because I was working with Tom on another game in LA and in San Francisco. So I was living in LA and kind of commuting up to San Francisco, and I had a friend who was kind enough to lend me his apartment because he was out of town for like pretty much all the time. Actually, I think around this time, I think I stayed in your extra. I was kind of bopping around various places, but I think I was in your place for a week or so at one point too. And anyway, so I was staying with this friend who lived in the Marina, which meant that I had like an hour plus long bus ride to Silicon Valley where EA is. And I got this email saying like, hey, do you guys want to write this book? And Tom was, doing 12 things at once. And I think he wasn't as interested. And I was like, oh, this will give me something to do on the bus. So I ended up writing the book mostly on the shuttle bus from the Marina to Redwood City, over the course of about a month or so. And I had never, I mean, it's probably 70 pages, double spaced in Word or something like that. But I had never actually written a book before, so that was really fun. And yeah, all the people at the publishing company were great, and and it's obviously a picture book, so it was a little bit more like the process of writing a comic book. It's just that rather than having panels and word bubbles, there were letters, and so in each section there was. I would kind of describe to the artist, a couple of assets from the world that we wanted to try to like a baseball card or featuring, Coltrane or whatever. And then there would be a letter from one of the characters to his probably already deceased parents, which was a little bit bittersweet or melancholy there. So that just kind of came up as it was just somebody said, I guess you people would be the right people to do this. And I was like, if you'll have me, I'd love to give it a shot.
How did the fans respond to that? Do they,
some of the, when we were working in Gears, there are a lot of fans who have done things like build the wiki, that kind of holds all the record of all the content and stuff like that. And so, what we try to do is actually sneak in some of their names and stuff like that as a little wink wink to thank them for all the help that they had occasionally given us. Like, I'd contact people over Twitter and just be like, okay, so what exactly happened? With Marcus's father or something. And we'd get into, and so we tried to sneak him in. So, I think for those fans, I think they liked the book. And in terms, I have no idea how it sold or anything else. There's probably still copies available on Amazon now, which probably means that, they haven't, it may not have exhausted the initial print run, but I don't know. I haven't looked at I'm sure it's, I'm sure the people who would buy a book like this are fans of the series. Hopefully there's enough there that they liked it. So
I'm just surprised they haven't tasked you with making an amusement park of Gears of War laser tag or something like that. Just keep building.
Oh no, yeah, there is such a thing. So in the Dubai Mall, probably 4 years ago, I saw and took a picture of and sent to Tom with a big smile. Basically exactly what you said. It was sort of a Gears of War themed like battle game, you put on essentially a laser tag vest, and you had a gun that looked like the chainsaw gun, if I'm not mistaken, from the series, and you would run around and shoot photons at your friends. And I didn't do it, but it looked great. And I didn't even know that existed. And honestly, I'm probably the last person that they would even imagine would be the right guy to build something like that. In addition to being the actual last person that should be building something like that. That's a lot of, complicated hardware and stuff that has to work relatively well, I think, to be worthy of the name Gears of War. But they did just announce, I think, a film and a TV series as well. So the IP is maybe we'll run out of those books. Well, yeah, maybe we'll sell out of those books yet. Never know.
Well, that maybe transitions us perfectly, Rob, to you're in the Dubai Mall looking at kind of an extension someone built of your massive world into a small world. Why did you start Hexagram? I'm curious what made you leave the AAA kind of studio world to start your own thing.
Sure. Well, for a while, I was trying to do both at the same time. So really what happened with what became Hexagram is I started working with a friend of mine named Patrick Marquesano on a story world that he had been developing with some photographers and artists and designers and a writer for some time. And he kind of sent me, we had met in New York through a mutual friend, some number of years prior. And he sent me a presentation of like what he was kind of working on. And I was like, this, and he was, I think, kind of thinking that it was going to exist as sort of almost like a digital magazine, or like a website that would have content that would update over time. And he had built some really, really cool sort of demos of like how what like a sort of editorial website felt like. But essentially it was this very in-world artifact from the world of the story. And I was like, this is what you're showing me is an alternate reality game, right? And I think he knew what they were, but I don't think he was thinking of the project in exactly those terms at the time. And so he and I worked together, and along with a ton of other really amazing people, and fashioned this experience into something that we released much more in a much more sort of what was at the time this sort of semi-standard ARG format, which is essentially, it's a series of websites and assets that are dropped in various places, and it sort of presupposes that the world of the story that you're experiencing is real, is based in reality. So that initial sort of foray into that world did really well. We had a lot of, like, the numbers were really strong, and we then started the company as a way to kind of parlay that audience into something that could be a monetizable product. That took a long time. Like we had a pretty good vision of what we wanted to do. It was complicated enough that it took a long time to do. So by the time that game came out, I think a lot of the original audience had shifted from from grade school to college, or it was around that. I think it was 5 years between the release of the first chapter of the game and the release of the actual app that we did eventually get out the door. And so, and it did, like, it was an iPad exclusive app. And so, through the metrics of what was normal at the time, and the iPad was relatively young, ish, we did fine. You know what I mean? Like, we weren't buying any islands or anything, but like, it was enough to kind of keep the company going. And then from there, we started getting a lot of opportunities just to work with really interesting partners on projects that where we may not have originated the IP, but we were able to kind of use some of the lessons of kind of creating that original game in various different ways.
So Hexagram did start then as a product. You had a specific product, the ARG game, and then it expanded into the studio model, right? Where you're doing consulting or game design for others.
Yep, exactly.
What are some of the best? I know you guys did something with James Cameron, right? And there's some more music videos. What's your favorite kind of Hexagram experience that you guys have created right now, or one you're proud of?
Yeah, I mean, most of the ones we can't really talk about, and that's sort of the nature of the business. Some of the more, so for example, actually, we just did. There's something that's live now that was really interesting. And our contribution was relatively small, but it was really fun. And it was a physical installation at a car launch, and it's actually for the new electric Cadillac. And in the actual space in the world where we showed this, there was a party to launch the car. There was there was a whole show that had been plotted out very meticulously, and there was this area where if you walked into this sort of dark room, you would see some particles sort of floating on a big, huge, sort of square screen in front of you. And as somebody walked in, those particles kind of came to life, and you'd hear a voice, and it guided you through the process of it asked questions about yourself, and then based upon the answers that you gave, that would influence elements of this kind of car this artwork, sorry, that you were creating. And so in the end, you were shown both a car that had been customized to the things that you said, but then also this kind of glowy, really cool sort of internal sort of glowing assemblage that you had shaped by answering these questions. And so what was fun for us was like, there was a pretty powerful semantic engine. Like, so the for every question that you were asked, like one of the questions was, I think, please describe your personal style. There are, 20 or more different categories of answers that you can give. And then for each of those, there's probably a couple hundred, or 100, depends on the category, 100 or so words that fit into those categories. And so so one of the categories might have been eclectic, or, one of the personal styles. So it could be like something like a classic or modern or elegant, or, over the top or whatever. And this would all determine. And so it's this pretty dense linguistic system. And then they asked us if we could translate it into 5 different languages. And that was a really cool challenge to kind of think through, the myriad different ways that you can actually pull something like this off. And then in the end, we got the actors who did the voiceover. We were able to work with some really new tech that's pretty exciting / scary, and use the original actor's voice to get her to speak all 5 of these languages. And so we were able to, so you can experience this well, now it's in a website,
So
in
use some
Chinese and Arabic and French, Spanish, English.
The deep fake type voicing tools that are out there.
Yeah. But I had never seen it where we actually got some. So she speaks, Spanish, with what I've been told by native Spanish speakers is a pretty solid like accent and elocution and everything. And that was just like, wow, okay. This is stepping into some really exciting stuff. So it's it's easy to say sort of the best project was the last project, but in this case it was a kind of confluence of a couple new things that were they're just on the horizon, and a couple of things that we really like to do, which is working with language and working with building a character and giving people a sense of kind of creation and participation in a process.
Talking of AI, where do you see AI playing into a game or toys, or where do you feel that? I'm curious what you see the future of that is. We talked about
I think we a little bit have to wait and see. There's a lot of conversations happening in the larger industry right now. I think most of the focus is presently on art, right? So people are curious, concerned, somewhere between the two, when they see an AI generating what essentially could be game quality art assets, both in 2D, and so sort of like concept art, and then also in 3D. There are. I just saw somebody posted, I think on Twitter, where there was a whole series of like full 3D models of like a spell book, like a sorcerer's, spell books and wisdom tome, that had been entirely created by AI. And so I've also seen a lot of people doing stuff with animation. And from a couple of years ago, it was sort of more procedurally driven systems that were sort of using machine learning to do things like have wolves wander around uneven terrain. And now I'm seeing some people doing stuff where it's like text to animation. Like, a man walks down the street and trips over a rock, and then, cook, and then suddenly you see like a stick figure or really, any riggable character walking down the street, and then boom, there he trips over the rock. And that's going to change the production process, obviously, massively, right? I mean, it's just going to have a huge impact in the way that really all content gets made. So there's that part of it where it's just, looking at it from production as a production efficiency, or I mean, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. You can, one artist can say, oh, amazing, I can get 10 times as much work done as I could before. And then the flip side of that is that one studio owner could say, great, now I need 10 times fewer concept artists. And so that's, figuring all that stuff out is going to be tricky, and figuring out, I mean, to the extent that it becomes a marketable skill to, get better at working with AI. And, there's a whole conversation around prompt authoring. There's obviously a whole conversation around attribution and, the limit, or the amount, from which these artworks are based upon the work of other people, which I think, completely legitimate concern. So that's happening on one side. In terms of, the stuff that we're more traditionally interested in, there's a lot of similar conversations happening around the generation. And so, people are playing with the ability to kind of have a character who some or all of whose script may come from a tool like GPT-3. And again, the ways in which you author the prompts of those characters, the way that, the way that you kind of describe the personality, is really important in terms of determining what comes out the other side. It's also a complete black box, right? So you can give the exact same prompt to the system 4 times in a row, and if the settings are in such a way that it's a little bit less determinative what it's going to say, you will get 4 different outputs, and sometimes massively different. I mean, sometimes it really, like, it just grabs a branch, and suddenly the tree snaps, and then you're just flying through the air with no idea where this conversation came from. So it can be, it's unpredictable. It's fun. I mean, talk about a toy. It's an amazing toy because you can just sort of really quickly set up these somewhat believable characters. It helps if they're a little broad, of course. These somewhat believable characters, and just let them. I mean, we have them talking to each other, and they'll, depending on their personality, and you can make it as simple, like, you can just add that, that one of the characters is angry and the other is giddy or something, and then you'll get the one word on either side will lead to a completely different outcome than you would have if you just said, a guy walks into a bar, right? It's like an angry guy walks into a bar, like, watch out.
Do you think
not going to go well?
The chat engines have right now the uncanny valley problem, so they just don't feel real enough? You still need the human.
There's a couple different variations on these large language model based systems like GPT-3, and it's arguably the best well-known. But the past quote unquote chatbot engines haven't really been driven over much. They're all authored. It's really what's driving, the existing kind of tech is more about sort of natural language understanding and saying, like, okay, I think the human is trying to tell me that they are hungry, right? And that could be, expressed as like, I need a snack, or I'm starving, or do you have any food? And all of those. And so kind of finding ways to kind of encode, quote unquote, those 3, very different utterances into, the human's trying to tell me that it's hungry, has been kind of, and then having a set answer typically for the output of that. So it's like, okay, the human's telling me that it's hungry. I'm going to say, you should probably take a break and have a snack or something like that. And that's, that character will, every time that somebody says something in the neighborhood of I'm hungry, it'll have, one, and you can write a couple more, but those responses are all written. So there hasn't been much, natural language generation going on up until the sort of advent of these newer LLM based tools. I mean, there have been, in the academic world, but they're not as practical, and they're not.
Rob, sorry to interrupt you. What is LM?
Oh, LM is large language model.
Got it. Just so people, going towards the other end, do you have any interest in, I mean, obviously virtual reality, metaverse, where do you see that kind of affecting game narrative and I'm just curious.
Oh, sure. I mean, I love VR. I mean, I have a headset here and probably still clock a decent number of hours on a weekly basis, particularly when there's some new, pretty extended. There's seemingly now there's a Among Us just came out, which is a massively popular mobile and PC title, just came out in VR, and supposedly it's like the experience of the the game fully in VR, and supposed to be just really a lot of fun. So I'll probably.
Which game is that?
Fire. Among Us was if you've ever played the game Werewolf, it's sort of a social game in which it's basically about lying and accusing each other of one another of being. So somebody basically there's a group of people. One of them is a werewolf. Nobody knows who it is. The werewolf signals to there's sort of like a host who they would want to kill. And when everybody closes their eyes, the werewolf opens his eyes and says, "I want to kill player number 2." Everybody closes. The werewolf closes their eyes. The host says, "Player number 2 is dead." Then everybody has to argue, okay, who's the werewolf? Clearly not the dead person. And so Among Us is sort of a variation on that, except that it puts people in a spaceship where they have to wander around and do little tasks. And one of the players of this, 6 or 8 or so people they're in the spaceship trying to do stuff, is actually, an imposter, an alien, whatever it is. And you have to kind of sneak up to the person and you kill them. And then when somebody finds the body, a meeting is called and everybody argues over text message about who did it. Now that it's VR, that's all shifting to voice. It's all shifting to, you're walking around the virtual ship. And I think this is some of the most interesting stuff about, to me, the best VR experiences are the ones that really take advantage as much as possible of the fact that you are actually embodied in the space. And so doing things like moving your body or, having to duck things, those are the games that are, the ones that in which people look the silliest while they're playing them are always the best. Because, it's just, that's the advantage that we have over a console, is that you can really be there and like you're really pulling the levers and boxing's a massively popular VR sport because it's even a good workout. So it's really interesting to see how what's kind of working in that space. And I think, to me, like doing a port like this where you're taking a top-down game and bringing it into like a fully kind of immersive environment is going to be a great harbinger for how we actually think about what makes a great VR experience. It isn't necessarily the same as isn't like what's popular on a console for a flat TV screen isn't necessarily going to transfer over as easily into VR. And so I think we'll find these new kind of experiences that are based around like that are social, that are embodied, that that are just that kind of do things well that you couldn't do in conventional games, and maybe someday are kind of closer to actually finding, like, for people who don't consider themselves gamers, a lot of these more social experiences don't have the intensity or the ferocity that traditional games do, that turn a lot of people off, right? Like a lot of people, like, they're like, video games, it's too much, like it's too much noise, too much information, too many buttons. What we're seeing with VR is actually a much simpler, in a way, interface paradigm, because you don't need to have as many buttons because you're just picking up the stuff with your hands and doing it yourself. You don't need to have like a button for pick up this or detach that. I think,
Rob, it reminds me of like a Nintendo with the Wii Sports. Like the simpler becomes the most popular, right?
No, exactly. Yeah, once the costs come down, and the thing is, optically VR isn't for everybody. Well, it's the same thing with like 3D movies. Like there's a good chunk of the population who aren't, who don't react well to seeing things in stereo, or simply can't. So there, again, it won't be for everybody all the time, but I do potentially seeing it be more like the Wii, where it's like you have families maybe who are remote from one another coming together to play games in VR and to do things in VR. It's you do get a real sense of presence out of a person. You can see them move their hands as they talk, and that kind of stuff's only going to get better. It's now a function of just like, who does everybody want to hang out with? That's the it has to become ubiquitous enough where, if I wanted to see a friend, I would, oh, cool, you're in VR, I'll jump in. We haven't hit that point yet. So now a lot of these spaces, and this, kind of extends to the whole metaverse thing too, a lot of these spaces are pretty empty. And so having to, let people get this feeling of like being part of a community of, strangers, that's a really difficult thing to do. And certainly, things like Second Life have done it in the past with some success. But yeah, what tends to happen is that those communities become a little bit more niche, and they're really just serving a group of people who like this kind of stuff. And so then the people who like this kind of stuff just sort of make friends in these worlds and hang out in these worlds. Whereas the goal is really to have a world where everybody feels comfortable, and that's I think there's a lot of challenges. Some of them technical, some of them social, some of them numbers based, like just in terms of ubiquity, that still are out there waiting to be solved.
Rob, on the other end, I think I saw that you worked on an escape room. That's like the other non-virtual reality game narrative or toy narrative. Did you work on a escape room, I think?
Kind of. I worked on actually like an escape room in a box, but so it was more like a toy.
Got it. So it was like a puzzle. Got it. Well, because yeah, it's almost like the haunted house experience where you have those. I think the escape rooms are interesting. It's like you said, the social, and then it takes you away from the real world into a different kind of.
Oh, they're great. No, they're it's a very specific kind of creation. And I mean, as close as I got to it was sort of this box sort of situation. But I have some friends who have been pretty successful in that world and who are really incredible designers. And when you go and play these rooms, I mean, just the ability to kind of bring narrative and tone and puzzles that are often whose whiskers have whiskers in terms of puzzles. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, it's not about obviously some people make incredible puzzles that are just completely unique, but most people are doing is really sequencing puzzles that have been more or less around for the chess puzzles or whatever, card puzzles or whatever it is, jigsaw puzzles. It's just all about the tone and the transitions and the vibe. And when done right, they're so much fun.
Rob, as we wind down, I'm curious, what is living in the Middle East like as a Westerner, and why you're there, and how, if anything, that's affecting Hexagram, positive?
No, it's living here. So, I moved to the Middle East because I met my wife working on a job here, and we got married a week before the gates went down at the airport, a week before COVID really hit. And so, not to say that I wouldn't be living here anyway, but we basically, we got married, and then within a week, weren't leaving the house. so that it just became like I hadn't really moved, a lot of possessions over here, and but it became home very quickly, and so it's been great. Which is just, but to be totally honest, I can't with any real definition say that I really know what living in the Middle East is like, just, other than because most of the time that I've been here, I haven't left the house. My wife's great. So that part's good. And in terms of Hexagram, it just basically means that I tend to stay up fairly late and work with the team, get on calls. But, again, most of the time, everybody's sort of been in the same boat in terms of, just being a box on a screen anyway. So it hasn't really, as long as I'm present, it's not really any different for most of the team. And, in doing so, it's kind of affected our hiring as well. So now we've become a lot more remote. And so I don't think that any of that's going to significantly change anytime soon. I think we'll probably continue to work, predominantly as a remote organization, unless something really massive changes.
And then going back to your college career with kind of comparative literature, do you think there's a comparative game literature, or how do you see? I'm just curious, when Japanese versus Russian versus American, is it all part of a similar global homogeneous culture, or do you see some random country or culture really deviating and creating something weird or different? Like, I don't know, what are North Koreans making games? China seems to have banned all video games except very simple ones. They seem terrified of narrative games. Nintendo and Japan, it just seems they always make the weirdest grind type games, so I'm curious what you think. Just what is video game comparative literature?
Oh, I think it's sort of like asking the same question about music, right? So there are there are roots, in any medium that are, I think, sort of inherent to culture. So like, for example, like pachinko in Japan. There are probably ways in which that has been a part of the design of any one of a number of games made in Japan, but and that's just not something that would have probably ever come from somebody who grew up in Milwaukee. So I mean, but also we're now so much more aware of each other's cultures that I think that you're certainly able to be. It's much easier to be, knowingly or not, inspired by like another kind of cultural tradition. And yeah, I mean, I think I think there's sort of I think everybody has their roots in whatever their experience has been and whatever they've had access to, and then from there, there certainly are, in the same way there are genres of music like like rock versus hip hop. People gravitate towards different styles, and certainly within each of those styles, there are people who come to those genres with roots in many different traditions. And so yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that that my assumption is that that any, just because a game is from Japan versus France versus Scotland, that it's going to have inherently any kind of set characteristics to it. I would probably say that, I will say that, when I load up a lot of particularly like older games made in Japan, you can tell they're a Japanese game just because of the fonts that the English fonts that they use. I'm like, oh, this is such a Japanese game. Look at these fonts. I don't know why, but Japanese developers tend to gravitate towards a certain kind of family of serif fonts that I'm sure you see them in non-Japanese games as well. But to me, I'm like, oh yeah, this feels like a Japanese game made for the Western market because of these fonts. Looking at you, Dark Souls. So there are kind of traits. But again, I mean, if I saw that font in the game, I'd probably, and if it was a Western game, I'd probably say, oh, this is such a Japanese game, and be wrong, right? So it's not necessarily that. There aren't any real tells, I would say, that definitively. I mean, and for example, there was a game that came out last year, the name of which is escaping me, that was made. It takes place in 16th, 17th century Japan. That was made by a team based in Seattle, and the game was a big hit in Japan. I think it was. I think people were surprised how popular it was in Japan, because that culture and sort of sense of authenticity it's not an easy thing to just kind of pick up and say cool, I got this. I'm going to just walk this one down, and let's see what people think. It's a lot of time and energy and research, and having the right team and to be able to do something like that. So it's certainly yeah. I think there's no certainty, I guess, is what I'd say.
Rob, for younger people who are maybe interested in the game world, do you recommend a career in game design, or not, or yes, or how should they approach that?
I mean, I think it's I think it's if it's something that you want to do, you'll know. It's as simple as that. You get to a little bit be depending on the kind of stuff you work on, you get to a little bit be the master of puppets, or the destroyer of worlds, and it scratches a certain kind of itch in somebody's personality. You're also if you're doing things like making puzzles, and you're trying to anticipate and maybe imagine yourself as being a little bit more. You have to be on top of your audience. You have to be careful, how you release information to them, and how you're same as making a film. It's at the end of the day more about producing. I mean, it's more about producing an emotion in the participant than it is, being smarter than your audience or anything like that. But you are engaged in a conversation with that person, and the tone of that conversation is yours to set. Now, how they feel and how you want them to feel, obviously, you can't. There's a lot in there that you can't control. But I do think you have more of a back and forth relationship with your audience as a game designer than you do in just about any other medium out there. So if that's of interest, and hopefully this leads to increasing empathy becoming a key, and it's just sort of the ability to kind of consider a larger group of people and to be more inclusive to more different types of people in your experiences. I mean, ideally that we'll see that continue as sort of a trend, because I think, at the end of the day, the more people who feel like that they're part of something that they care about, I think, so much the better.
And then Rob, what's next for Hexagram right now?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. Ask me again in 6 months, and I'll probably have a better answer.
Anyway, Rob, thank you so much. I really appreciate all your answers. It's a huge world. The thing I took most away from it is that I like how you call them toys instead of, video games, or limiting it to that. And it's just narrative objects is a very interesting concept for people to think about in a bigger world, like everything, like from the puzzles to the escape rooms to VR.
Everybody can find their own path. It's a big industry, and there's a lot of opportunity there. So yeah, of course, I appreciate you asking me to participate. Yeah, like I said, maybe there'll be more to talk about in the days ahead.